Hi everyone, welcome back to the Red Sofa. Very pleased to be joined by Martin Corner, who's leading supply chain at Aston Martin and has had a career in supply chain across a number of different OEMs. And you've been here in particular talking about some of the complexity that came with creating the supply chain organization at Aston Martin and building up that function. Let's start with what is it that is complex about Aston Martin? Of course, an ultra-luxury brand with low volumes. Give us a little bit of a flavor.
That's a huge part of it, obviously, Chris. And I think the complexity element, it's a very engineering and design-led organization for that ultra-luxury feel. So there's the element of the amount of complexity in the product and the fact that I think model to model, within model years, if there's something the design or engineering team think will enhance the product, they'll make that change. So we need to be more agile, and that's on the backdrop of, let's say, a more complex supply base because of it.
Yeah.
And that complex supply base is things like carbon. You know, we've got a much higher carbon content in our cars. Yeah. We offer the customers much more opportunity to bespoke the trim inside the car in terms of stitching, colours, colour combinations. So those things are the things that stand out that are very different. And then the backdrop of that is our lack of leverage with the supply base. Yeah. So we're playing the same game as all the other OEMs on the same pitch, if you want to call it that. You know, we design, develop the cars and source the parts, but we're doing it on a tiny volume, and our annual volume is far less than most OEMs' weekly volume. So running the supply chain as well with that in mind is very challenging in the context of lots of flows, lots of routes, very low volumes, and most of our volume probably the suppliers would prefer to build it in a day and ship it all to us, our annual volume. Right. But the reality is we've still got to get that balance of that sort of just-in-time, lean. Yeah, exactly. It's not possible. So yeah, there's a lot of complexity, but being that independent OEM without a big brother or big sister, if you want to call it, like Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Lamborghini all have. Yeah. Means that we've got to do it ourselves, and we don't have that leverage and economies of scale support that some of the other ultra-luxury brands have.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that you've done to stabilize the supply chain and start to build the function is to implement a sales and operation planning, S&OP function. Can you tell a little bit about what was particularly important about that and what impacts you've seen from implementing it?
Yeah, I mean, the critical thing, as we know with sales and operations planning, is to create a decision-making process that's one version of the truth and end-to-end across the company. So when we started at Aston, again, it was still acting like a sort of boutique business, and production had to run production, supply chain had to get the parts in and distribute the cars. But really the commercial side of things, there were decisions being made by the CEO at the time, directly with the chief commercial officer. And of course that was creating big fluctuations. And sometimes, I guess the company was being curveballed by, if you have certain stock building in certain markets and you're not tracking that, then you end up doing a huge correction rather than a adaptive rolling correction on a monthly basis to balance supply and demand. So we focused a lot in the first year or so on, let's call it the sales and operations execution part of it, putting the controls in place. We were planning at car level, and without any of the features or take rates built into the modelling. So I know in the plenary session yesterday we gave an example of the harnesses where with 56 harnesses on a model where you're making 10 cars a day or 30 or 40 a week, you can very easily get that wrong. So we first built up the controls in terms of planning at car and feature level, sticking to sequence, that then stabilised production. And this year, with the new CEO being in place, we've actually put in the end-to-end supply chain process. Monthly cycle starts with a demand meeting with sales and ends with the combined S&OP group, which is supply chain, sales and finance, making the proposal for the next 18-month rolling forecast. So it's in its early days, but that's built up on data, transparent information on stock levels in the market, retail trajectory trends. So it's gone from being, I'd say, a production-based focus to a end-to-end process. So data's the key to it, and transparency.
And that supply chain is firmly at the table, so helping to steer and influence decisions. So it'll be exciting to see how that develops. You mentioned obviously Aston Martin is a design and engineering driven and focused car maker, and rightfully so, it's beautiful products. But how do we find the balance there, or how are you looking to now find the balance now that you have more of that influence and that data, to not compromise obviously on the design, but to be focused on where's the value?
That's the critical point.
Yeah.
So the brand strategy, and again, the new CEO and the new Chief Commercial Officer want to drive this is, they want to bring more options to the product actually. Yeah. The new CEO's he's previously from Bentley, and he's very clear on our products have a certain amount of feature offerings that we can actually drive extra revenue from compared to our competitors. So I think increasing personalisation and complexity on revenue driving, great. What we need to do though is standardise more.
Yes.
And maybe the design and engineering team's going to hate me saying this, but there are parts of the car that is not driving revenue and doesn't need to change model to model or model year to model year, whether it's clips on the sun visor, for example. Yeah. To be fair, they change every time in Aston because somebody's trying to improve it, but those sort of basic I'd say brand features, they don't need to change, and we can adopt a bit more carry across, control the costs, control the income statement better, drive more profit, and focus on putting the complexity in where it actually benefits the customer. It's very visual. Absolutely. And then that will make the supply chain more efficient and easier to manage as well.
Just to touch on briefly the logistics challenge, the role, how can logistics providers help? Because clearly you talk about the scale and the volume. Yeah. That must be also a challenge, obviously, to fill trucks and to be optimal in that way. So, how can logistics providers help you on that journey as well?
Very much so. I mean, I've heard a lot in the session this week about digital twins, generative AI, but actually how that's being used to run control towers. And for Aston particularly, that will be a massive help for us because our volume is sort of just skimming on the top probably of milk runs or flows that the logistics providers have with other customers or bigger OEMs. And if we can take advantage of our parts going into those spare bits of capacity, that's a way of really optimizing it. And the second part, I think, is a link to your last question on complexity. We've got a lot of suppliers for body parts, for example, in Europe, which is an inefficient part of the car to transport long distances. So if we reduce the complexity and our logistics providers help us build the business cases as to the logistics cost, even outweighing the piece price in some instances, it'll help us change the sourcing process as well. So the logistics modelling and then the sort of financial business case modelling that the logistics partners can do with us will be a huge help.
Martin, something that we've spoken a lot about over the past years is whether supply chain would elevate to a proper board level position, have that orchestrating and influential role. We have seen some chief supply chain officers, we've seen some emphasis there, but how do you see the role developing? Where do you still see gaps that we should cover to let's say, realize this ambition?
Yeah, I think there are definitely gaps. What I've seen, and I agree, it's encouraging the chief supply chain officer roles started. Some of them have seemed to have been disbanded and put back into operations like Stellantis, but the discussions I have with my peers and colleagues is that even the companies that have got a chief supply chain officer role, still the functions within the title are doing the traditional roles in the way they've always been done. So procurement's still procurement, logistics is still logistics, manufacturing still manufacturing, and that the function that I think should be part of a chief supply chain officer's role is that end-to-end total cost of ownership department, which effectively drives the brand promise and creates a value chain based on that, let's say, simplified, lowest cost, lowest invested capital, best resilience, best ESG credentials, and really creates that sort of end-to-end business model that then ultimately turns into an execution point when you make the car. And I don't see the trajectory, excuse me, moving with momentum towards that sort of a role yet. But for me, it's a no-brainer. That's the way it needs to get in the future if automotive companies want to protect their margins and be successful and deal with this sort of volatile global supply and geopolitical situation we face. So I hope it starts to accelerate again, but it seems to have stalled, in my opinion.
Well, we'll be keeping a close eye. It's obviously a cause we're championing, and we know that the interest is there from many else in the industry. But Martin, thank you so much for sharing these insights. It's always so strategic and interesting. And check out more from Automotive Logistics on the journey at Aston Martin and the journey to Chief Supply Chain Officer. Thanks very much.